All right, welcome to the last Gateway API meeting for 2023. I've got a few things on the agenda today, almost all of them from me, so apologies for that, but I think it should be a fairly light agenda. As always, don't hesitate to add things to the agenda, drop things in chat, whatever's easiest for you. Would encourage everyone to, follow Kubernetes Code of Conduct because this is a Kubernetes community meeting. And also just to be nice and make sure everyone gets a chance to speak that wants to, encourage you to use Zoom's raise hand feature so that everyone gets a turn to talk that wants one. Okay, with that, just a bit of housekeeping here. The next meeting is not until January, and I can't remember exactly if it's January 8 or 9, but a good ways into January at this point. And because that will be our first meeting of the month at that point, we are looking at probably doing an EU time, but need to confirm that. So yeah, that is our next meeting a week and a bit into January. Then I think next on our agenda is actually from Lior and Kobe here. And this is an interesting idea. If we didn't already have enough conformance tests in Gateway API, the idea of having conformance tests for ingress to Gateway is really interesting to me. I don't know. It looks like they're just looking for some feedback on this one. I don't have a lot of context to add more information. On a surface conformance test for ingress to gateway seem like they'd be awfully close to just like integration tests or end-to-end. I'm not sure. Anyone else already look at this one?
No, but it sounds reasonable.
Yeah.
I'll
Okay.
slide.
I'll just leave that there and encourage people, including apparently myself, who are overdue to take a look at this one. But yeah, appreciate them adding that to the agenda. Now I'll just run through some issues that I've either created or been involved with recently. There have been a few installation, maybe just two installation issues that have been created in the past week or two with people trying to install the Gateway CRDs, a recent set of Gateway CRDs. That led to a couple proposals from my side. One of them is something that we've talked about in passing a few different times, but never really wrote down in any great detail. I think Nick actually wrote it down a bit in the CRD management
It's
implementers
in
guide,
the
I think, as
yeah,
something that you
it's
could
the
do.
CRD management section of the implementers guide. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. But I don't think this had been tracked, as an issue before anyway. But I am increasingly thinking that we need to provide better ways for implementations to bundle Gateway API CRDs. I definitely understand the perspective of somebody that is owning a implementation that's deployed in a cluster and they want to bundle Gateway API CRDs, but they also don't want to overwrite or, conflict with other CRDs that may already be in the cluster. Let's say one implementation bundles v1.0 and the other bundles v1.1. You don't want one to clobber the other, etc. Right? And so and then also related to this, there's a corresponding issue 1590 that's requested a Helm chart or something that could be added to a Helm chart that could also manage CRDs for you. And the overall idea here is that it's not really safe to do anything with that could clobber. And in the case of Helm, it would actually do the opposite. If they already exist, it's just not going to touch them. It will never update the CRDs, etc. Neither is great. What this proposes is a very simple Kubernetes job that has some very simple logic that just says, hey, skip or error if there's a CRD out there, but it's something that I can't safely upgrade from. But then if on the other hand, it is something like I say can safely upgrade to, I will upgrade it. Or if it doesn't exist at all, I'll just install it, right? So theoretically, this could be as simple as a shell script that's built on top of the kubectl image. Um, doesn't need to be anything fancier than that, but I can see real value in providing this. But at the end of the day, I want to be very clear, this is not ready for work. We need, hopefully in this meeting, but maybe follow-up meeting as well, we just need to understand if this is actually a good idea, if this is something like implementations would pick up and run with. Um, any thoughts, concerns, uh, anything on this idea?
I think the overall idea is great. I think you're having a one-shot job that sort of says, hey, make sure that at least this version is running in the cluster. Seems like a really good idea to me. I agree that an initial version could be built with the kubectl image. I suspect that will not fly for a number of reasons longer term. This thing really should be self-contained. So I would say probably what we want to do is actually make it be that we release this as an artifact as part of the including a container image, and that container image includes the experimental and standard YAMLs for that particular version. And then that way there's no reaching out over the network or anything like that, because people will be like, hey, I can't run this in an air gap cluster. And yeah, and I think that there's probably it will be worth, whoever picks this up needs to build like essentially a truth table of what happens if you're on standard and someone wants to upgrade to experimental. What happens if you're on experimental and someone wants to upgrade to a higher version on standard, or similar. I think there might be some things there that we need to fiddle with, but and just make either options for, or sort of define. We just need to define the various things there. But once we do that, I think that this is going to be a really great way, because then we can safely provide a Helm chart that says, here is the job, and it is a job. It's a single shot thing that either succeeds or fails. And then other things can depend on that Helm chart to say, I need some Gateway API installed, please. And I really like that, because it makes it really easy, and it means that it makes the Helm management easier. It makes general management easier, because even if you don't use Helm, you can pick up the YAMLs, and upgrading the Gateway API in your cluster becomes upgrading this job, or rerunning this job, running a new version of this job. The job would probably have to have the name of the version in it so that it won't conflict. But anyway, there's a few other ops things like that, but I think I'm very +1 on this. It would be a great way to, I think this will go a long way to solve the sort of how do I make Gateway API available in a standard way problem.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think those are good points. So what it sounds like here is that
I'll put a comment on the issue to the effect too, by the way.
perfect. Thank you. Yeah. So I think maybe the next steps here are that we need a bit more information about how this would be scoped out. But the specific logic, maybe a truth table like Nick mentioned, about how each input would be resolved. But I think this is a path we want to move forward with. This would be awesome to get somebody to own. I think this, obviously, if you are working on an in-cluster implementation, or if you're an end user and just have felt the pain of managing gateway CRDs, I feel like this is a really great spot to jump in and help out. So yeah, this
I think
is
once we get this ready, this will be a good help wanted candidate. Probably not a good first issue, but definitely a help
yes,
wanted. Yeah.
yep, agreed. Cool. All right, next up, this is one that already has an LGTM, but thank you, Nick. And I'll probably remove the hold shortly, but I just wanted to throw this out in front of a meeting in case anyone wanted to take a look, double check anything that we may have missed here. This makes a few changes. Maybe it's easiest to see on the deploy preview. So let me take a quick look over there. If you look at the guides, everything is now, well, most things are now under user guide, but then we've taken some other things that were in other sections and added them here. So the API design guide, CRD management is net new, and implementers guide. CRD management is actually something that got pulled out of the implementers guide because it's something that like implementers do, but also sometimes cluster admins do. It's like a little unclear who really owns that. It's going to depend on the specific organization. So yeah, there's a whole new guide on that, and this attempts to cover a lot of things. In particular, something that tripped at least one person up was if you have CRDs that have been around since 0.5 in the same cluster, and you have at least one of those that has been unchanged in that period of time, and you upgrade to 1.0, you'll be in for some pain, or it just won't let you. It's more correct. Because something will still be stored with Alpha 2 as the storage version. And so this kind of runs through a guide for what on earth that means, how you can handle it, etc. Because I know this has been a weak spot, or, specifically this area of like what happens when an API version is removed is something that had not been answered in the docs before. And so, yeah, this is my attempt at answering it. If there are no concerns, I'll remove the hold after this meeting and get that one in. Okay, this is more contentious maybe, but I got more pushback in the last meeting on this idea of, maybe we just shouldn't have this strict requirement that certificate refs be required when TLS mode is terminate. So I wrote up a whole bunch of stuff around why I think we should allow certificate refs to be empty, not require, not anything like that. I have my own very strong opinions on why, for, the use case that I'm considering with it, which is GKE or a cloud provider or anyone who is managing certs that may live outside of a cluster. You really only have three options that I can think of. One, a virtual resource, which is basically an object ref to something that doesn't actually exist, but it's basically a way to refer to something outside of the cluster, right? Say example vendor, this TLS cert is just something outside of the cluster. I think that could confuse people, but it is an option. You could have a intermediate custom resource in between. So that thing, instead of just being a reference to some other thing outside the cluster, is actually a reference inside that then refers outside. That has, I think, many, many cons, which I'm concerned about. And then there's the other option, which I think we want to at least allow, which is just to make use of TLS options or something like that to specify, hey, this is a certificate name that is, maybe an ARN on a different cloud provider, or some kind of like resource ID that is meaningful to the implementation that can be used. Seems like a very useful idea here. And something like that, at a minimum, I don't think we want to rule out. And then maybe, made it through a lot of things here, but there is one other use case that I think is really critical here. And that's that I think we want to support people creating gateways that can have certificates generated and added after they're created, right? So you can imagine that there is one person, one persona that's creating the gateway, and a separate, say, automation, something like Cert Manager, for example, that hops in and actually populates the certificate references after. The current validation is strict enough that it would not allow for that use case. And so for those reasons, I think we should step back that validation. But again, that's my opinion here. Open to other thoughts.
I have some more to say, but I would like to leave the floor open for other people first. Okay, anyone? Oh, I mean, if you don't want to listen to me talk about this, then you have a chance. Okay. Okay. So yeah, I think that the biggest thing that I'm worried about here is making it too easy to make. So the really nice thing about this is that it lets people understand that when they have made the error of, say, a typo in their certificate thing, that it tells them immediately and it won't let you apply, like, or you've missed something, right? Making this optional means that in order to know that you've messed up your TLS config, you'll need to go and look at the status. I mean, which is not the end of the world, because we need to, we need to teach people to look at the status. But so the use case we're talking about here is your protocol is set to HTTPS, and you leave the TLS stanza empty, or you leave the actual certificate refs mode empty. Because if you leave the TLS mode empty, TLS stanza empty, then the modes should default to terminate anyway. So I know, I'm pretty confident that people may be like, we will need to be careful about ensuring that we have conformance tests to test this, because currently there's a sort of slightly implied thing that if TLS is nil, and your protocol is HTTPS, then that's just, you're broken, right? Like, because certificate refs is required. So people may just be doing like a lazy check of that. And so it will be important that we have tests that check that gets picked up properly, and that creates the status errors and so on. There will be, in general, I tend to prefer things that have resources in the cluster, because that makes the config sort of consistent within the cluster, and the cluster is the system of record. I accept that it's kind of funky when you have things that exist outside the cluster. I think out of these options, like, leaving, I think that, and the other thing that I'm really worried about here is portability. If you do a custom TLS option, or those things, it's harder for, or just have an empty certificate refs stanza, then then especially an empty one, because that means that on some providers it'll work and on some providers it doesn't, and there's no difference in the spec. I mean, it's not a huge deal. But yeah, I think it's probably okay to just make this optional, but I think that the PR needs to include conformance tests that define and test the behavior when you do leave it empty. What is the behavior you should have, and if so, and if you do that, like, how should you check? And so I think, there's a couple of things there that I would want to make sure we checked. Is the main thing I'm thinking.
Yeah, no, I think you're completely right. That is an underspecified part of the API right now. Like, what if there's a gateway that has TLS mode terminate and certificate refs is, there is no certificate mentioned in any way, right? Which is something like we can and probably should cover with conformance, and that would need to have some kind of standard pattern for status. I think that's a very reasonable requirement as part of any change here, just so that we're going to a well-defined future state. And this is something like that. Yeah, would definitely need release notes, awareness, etc. I definitely get all those things. I get that in most cases, what you're saying there, the bias towards in-cluster resources is definitely sensible, and I generally like that idea of having everything configured in the cluster. I think it's just there are some gateway implementations that are configuring things outside the cluster, mainly cloud providers. And when that happens, if you have, like, it feels really frustrating or, unnecessary if you have a certificate that lives outside of the cluster to try and pull that in somehow, like some products, many cloud providers have a way to automatically generate certs, for example, on a gateway or on an LB, I should say. And it feels really unnecessary to try and like pull the certificate ref pattern out for that. Like it doesn't exactly fit in those kind of like generate after the fact kind of certificates. And I think that even applies even in cluster if it's something that's going to generate a certificate for you and plop it in. Yeah, anyway. Um,
Yeah, thanks, Michael. He just pointed out that backend TLS ref has two ways of referencing this, where you can say, hey, use the CA certs, the system CA certs. It's a little bit different here, I think, because this is more specific. You're saying, hey, for this thing, we need to specify a serving cert somehow, which is different to. However, if we do make certificate refs optional, that does sort of allow a flow where a controller will, if you don't supply certificate refs, it will fill them in for you, like implicitly fill them in for you with the default. Do we want to allow that? I don't know. Again, the thing that I don't like about that is that it means that there's now config that is being used that is not represented in the resource, right? So if I'm a user, I have no way of knowing what the certificate is. That if you don't have config that, if you don't require some config there, then I, as a user, I have no way of knowing what certificate's in use, and I have no way of knowing if that certificate is working. Right. So the problem with making this optional means that then there's no way to close the door after we open that door, because like sure, you can say, hey, you need to do something, but because we can't mandate what the something is, and because people may need to do different things, then we're effectively opening the door and allowing people to do anything, because we can't say you can only do this set of things because it's an unbounded set of things. We could say, hey, you're allowed to use a TLS option that looks like this, but that doesn't. But the point of TLS options is that you can expand them with a vendor.com prefix, right? So we can't mandate things there. So the more I think about this, the more I'm worried that this is going to be both. It's going to allow like implementations to do stuff that I'm not sure we want. Like I think that allowing people to do things that implicitly change the object's config without the people who own that object being able to see that config in somewhere in the object is really bad UX. And like it's going to cause troubleshooting problems down the road. This is the same sort of problem that we have with policy attachment, right? Like, like if there's a certificate that's being used there and you have no way of checking that certificate is knowing which certificate is being used, then that kind of sucks. I can't, I can't say, if there's no way to mandate that the thing is there, and I create a thing that doesn't have certificate refs, how do I know what certificate is being used, right? Like, or if there is one, or, the status will tell me some things, but it's not going to be represented in the spec anywhere. And is that something we want? I don't know. I think I need to think more about that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point, and I would just say that there's we absolutely should be aiming the API to make it as easy as possible to understand what's going on. I think you and I both absolutely agree there. The thing that I would just highlight here is that we don't necessarily need that to come in the form of spec and in the form of configuration, right? The less that an end user needs to configure here, the better it can be. I can imagine that it would be a really great feature if I were an end user and I wanted to try out an implementation, and that implementation told me, hey, I'll generate certs for you and I'll populate them on your gateway, on your whatever, and at the same time, I'll drop something in status to explain what happened or explain what certificate is actually programmed. I think that's a huge win in terms of UX instead of requiring end users to manually, fill this in themselves. I'm not saying that that's a win for every individual use case. We still want people to be able to specify this themselves. I just think we need to allow the other path of something to populate this after the fact, or this to be populated in some other way that lends itself to automation. Yeah, Phil?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say something similar. I think there is value. There are situations where you don't necessarily want an application to know what certificate's being used.
So you don't want an application to know like the details of the key that's being used, or like because
or possibly even whether it is being used. I mean, the thing is, it depends on how much you trust your applications, and you know, if you don't trust your applications, you don't want them to know a damn thing about what's good, what you know.
Okay, yeah.
About the certificate.
I mean, I would argue that the person who owns the gateway at least should know what certificate is being used.
Yeah.
And yeah.
So
the person and that's yeah. Sorry.
I agree with that.
Yeah. So, I mean, it feels to me like what you're talking about, Rob, is something a bit more like what we have for address, where you can specify it, but there's a bit in status that says this is the one that you got, right? And so if you specify it, the one that you end up with in status is the one that you specified. But if you don't specify it, then the one that in status is determined by some other process, but you can always look in the status to see the one that you actually got. Yeah.
Yeah, roughly like that, right? You know, you don't want people to be doing their own IPAM, right, for gateways, but you do want it to be very clear and that they can, like, you know, they can request an IP, and at the same time, you want it to be very clear what IP they got in status.
Yeah.
So I think the same general pattern applies here.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's some stuff we would have to figure out about how you represent an arbitrary external resource, right? Like, you know, but there are ways that we could do that with like types or something, right? Like, you know, so yeah, I think that it sounds to me like that's what we're talking about here is if we're going to loosen this thing, we can't do it without a corresponding status stanza, I think.
Yeah, no, I think that's very reasonable. Good feedback all around. Maybe if anyone wants to write up a comment just summarizing that, I think that's good feedback, and it can make sure that's addressed. Yeah, good feedback. Cool. Any last comments or thoughts on this one? All right.
I will write that up, Rob.
You're the best. Thanks, Nick. Next one is hopefully just really straightforward. Lior, I think, brought this up in the context of ingress to gateway. Some Kubernetes repositories have moved to change in default merge behavior to squash PRs on merge, squash all the commits in a PR just by default. You can still choose a different merge method if you want, but by default, squash would be what was selected. I think that's a pretty good idea overall. I kind of pointed out that the official Kubernetes developer guide, GitHub workflow, whatever this is, actually encourages contributors to squash commits before merging, but that feels unnecessarily manual. I mean, it's great if you want to, but now that we can do it automatically, that tends to be maybe a bit easier and more uniform across. So I tend to just lean towards that change, but if anybody has concerns, I will hold off. But if not, just look out because that may come in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, I mean, I'm generally in favor of it because it makes it easier for new folks to contribute without needing to know a lot about, you know, how to do a rebase or that sort of thing. They can just, you know, when they get more PR changes, they can just do another commit, fix PR comments, right? Like, and then at the end of the day, we don't end up with a whole bunch of stuff in our main that's just fix PR comments, fix PR comments, fix PR comments. You know, we end up with meaningful changes. I do think that it's yeah, when you've got a bigger PR, we should definitely you know, encourage people to structure their commits and to you know, sort of make meaningful changes in each commit. And in those cases, we just flip the merge method. I just have to make sure I have a note somewhere about how to flip the merge method because I always forget the slash commands.
Yeah, there's a very obscure label that we'll need to document somewhere if we make this. Well, I mean, we should document it either way, but it's slash label merge method. I don't know, whatever. But Yeah, good call. Okay, last thing for me, just a really small announcement that if you happen to have a GCP account, there's actually, if you go through the Google Cloud Console, you can see all the gateways, HTTP routes, etc. on your cluster, and status and like an actual UI around this stuff now, which is really exciting. Of course, I'm biased. But yeah, just a heads up. Hopefully more of these things start popping up around and about, but just
I would
that
actually
exists if
request
anyone wants to try it out.
for a future meeting, could you run us through what that looks like, Rob?
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. I didn't want to do too much of a vendor pitch, but I'm
No, I
very
mean,
happy to
I
if
think it's reasonable to say this is here is a UI that does some that does Gateway API stuff. Here's how we've done it. Consider how you could do it. Like that's I don't
yeah.
think that's too bad pitchy, Rob.
Cool. Yeah,
Anyone
I'll
else should
definitely
feel
plan
free
on
to
it.
object. But in my mind, like it seems pretty reasonable.
Sweet. Yeah. No, that's great. And yeah, I mean, I'm just excited to have it out, and in case it's not obvious, this applies to all gateways, all HTTP routes in the cluster. This is not in any way limited to just ones that are implemented by GKE. So yeah, cool. And with that, I think we're to your item, Nick.
Yeah, cool. I'm gonna still screen share. Ooh, no, let me just rearrange my screen so I'm looking at the right places. Okay. Okay, so I just wanted to quickly show where I'm up to. I am working on a GEP to update the GEP process and also add ways to do that. Yeah, I like to think of this as the GEP, or so I heard you like GEPs. I have there's a couple of some spoilers there for changes. This is the overview page, and this is the thing. There's a couple of things here. There's a type. So the goal of this is to do a few changes. Firstly, a small change to we usually use RFC 2119 language, which is must, may, should, etc. There is an addendum to that that specifies that you have to have them in RFC 8174, that those have to be in all caps for them to have that meaning. Otherwise, they just have the normal English meaning, which is not as strong. I think we need to do that. But yeah, then I also wanted to do some stuff about adding relationships between GEPs. And in order to do that, we also need sort of a new category of GEPs. I've called it a memorandum. I'm not 100% happy with the name, but I haven't been able to come up with anything better. Suggestions welcome. Memorandums are things that so these GEPs record an agreement on either the definition of the problem and its scope in a common language, or further process changes to the GEPs. The ones that we have so far that are memorandums are gateway conformance that I've moved to memorandum is just conformance testing. This basically says what is conformance, why do we want to do it. There's no API changes in this GEP. Same for versioning, and same for the base service mesh GEP. So this is basically just an agreement that we should do service mesh, and here's some ideas about how it might work, but there's no API. And then the last one for this last one. Yes, Rob.
It seems like there are a lot of things that could actually fit under memorandum, including like the one that came to mind was the conformance profiles one, which like
that has API changes in it. So I have kept that as API.
What does it?
The rubric that I have been using is if it has API changes, then that are going to need to go through a provisional experimental standard flow, then the GEP is an API GEP. That's the other type.
So I guess the idea here is that the API here is the conformance report.
Yes.
But okay. So now I'm gonna go like full circle. This feels like as much of an API as the API you're proposing in the GEP, which is
okay, sure. Like, so
I'm
yeah. So this one maybe it's also a memorandum GEP. I think that the reason I wanted to leave it here is that it should flow a bit more through the sort of it's like still experimental and we haven't accepted it. One of the other key things about a memorandum gap is that there's really only one state. It's like you accept it and that's it, right? Like there's no sort of graduation criteria. It's like it's the record of an agreement. And so you like for get process changes, like you there's no way to sort of gradually make those changes. You either make them or you don't. And so I think that's the other thing about memorandums that's critical is that they're intended to be sort of one and done discussions. Like you have the discussion and then you're done. And so that's the same with the service mesh. So the ones that are recorded here, all of those are, sort of have that property that we agreed that we were going to do conformance testing. We agreed that we would do gateway API versioning in a certain way. We agreed that we would do service mesh in a certain way. We hopefully will agree that we will change the get process in this way. And then, for other things where we do need to spend a bit of time experimenting with them, I feel like it still kind of is an API gap. I agree that the conformance profiles are a bit of a gray area. I mean, if you think I should pull out, so the other thing that I have added into the 2659 is a metadata schema for gaps. I did not anticipate that there would be a huge amount of backwards and forwards on this. This is very much based on the KEP metadata file. And that it expands the relationships a bit. But it records the authors, the type, the name. I did add this latest release one. I'm not 100% sure if I want to keep it. I'm going to think about it a bit more. But yeah, so the other thing that I did do here is I've added this as a Go type that's in a package, so that if we write tooling to consume this, we have a way to deserialize this into a Go struct so that you can do stuff with it. It's pretty simple Go struct, and it doesn't, it uses the API version of kind stuff because that's what we're all used to. But I should note it does not have the standard Kubernetes metadata section, the same as conformance reports. So you're right, Rob, in that it does have an API, so technically it's an API in that respect. But I kind of don't feel like we will. Again, the idea here is not to figure out the details of the API in this specific PR. It's just to put something in place, and then we can iterate on the YAMLs as we go. I mean, the annoying part about iterating on the YAMLs is that if you make a substantial change to this struct, then you have to reflect it in the YAMLs that I have actually added a YAML for every existing gap. So that when and if this merges, then there will be a YAML file for every existing gap that we can use in tooling or whatever. And so the thing I'm hoping to do with adding the YAML files is that it will mean that we should be able to programmatically generate this list a bit more easily, like which things are in which level. And also, conceivably we can do stuff like put the details from the YAML in front matter instead of having to put them in manually. It's possible to give us sort of an overview of which ones are in which stage, and there's a bunch of tooling stuff that we can do to make things easier once we have the metadata files. I kind of feel like, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that there's going to be a lot of opposition to the idea of having metadata files. It's probably going to be the exact spec that we might argue about. So if you think that I should pull that out of this PR, fine. But I was just trying to get everything done all at once so that it would be easier to consume. Yes, Rob.
Yeah, just another note, like I don't hate the idea of API version. What I do want to make it crystal clear, and I don't think an API version really communicates it well, or the current one does, is that I think whatever we do here is something that we would consider internal only, and we can make backwards incompatible changes at will because we're only intending to break ourselves. And I think the same general pattern applies to conformance reports, which is also an internal API. So whatever we define that is, and I think right now that's also the same API version, but whatever that is, I think it should be the same thing. And I think it should be clear that it's different than the rest, right? Like,
I think you're right. I think we should put internal on the front of the API version.
Yeah, like internal is a good indicator. Yeah. There's like the x-kates.io which we used in early days too, which also means like no promises. Whatever it is, just to make it extra clear this is something different. Yeah,
Yeah.
but I love to see this. Lots of, I think this has been overdue. And I'm excited to see the tooling we can build on top of this that will make things like Matia's work to add a table of contents basically, or have tooling that confirms that what we have in navigation actually lines up with what our GEP metadata says, because we forget to move GEPs around navigation all the time. Like this is the start of many, many good things. So I'm excited to see it come in.
Yeah. So I would just encourage everyone to just have a think about the goals here. Actually, I should remove that from the non-goals because I've actually done that. Yeah, I was not intending to, but yeah, I think it's actually been easier to just do that. So I'll remove that from the non-goals. But yeah, so the other things that I've done here is I put an update in the overview that sort of walks through the different states, types, and I also have defined all the states, which we had never done before, except in the thing. We've never actually written down what the states mean anywhere. I did check. Yeah, and so yeah, we've also got relationships. Thank you, typos. But yeah, so there's only 3 relationships at the moment: obsoletes and updates and see also. The last thing that I actually I think I did add to the spec, but I haven't actually used anywhere yet, is in the YAML. There's also I've added a references array, which is an array of hyperlinks to some reference that we have. So that will also give us a sort of machine parsable way to keep track of where the original discussion was or whatever.
That's awesome.
Yeah, so I'd encourage people to have a look at this. I will open the PR probably later today, my time. So yeah, I'd encourage people to have a look at this and give me some reviews as soon as possible. The other thing that this is relevant for is that this GEP is currently about nearly 17,000 words. So one of the things that I want to do is to break up this GEP. And the reason that one of the reasons I'm introducing memorandum as a status is that I want to strip all of the API suggestions, the status stuff, the details about direct policy attachment and inherited policy attachments. I want to strip all that out into separate GEPs, and have those GEPs be updates to the memorandum GEP. And that's sort of the pattern I want us to use going forward, is that for something that's really big like this, we have a memorandum that lays out the ground rules and sort of says what we want to do. And then we have more specific GEPs that pick up specific things from those things and generate the APIs. That means that we can then graduate those APIs separately. So importantly, that will mean that we can graduate, say, direct policy attachment indifferently to the inherited policy attachment, which I think is probably useful because direct policy attachment is way more usable at the moment than inherited is. And so it seems very viable that we might be able to graduate direct policy attachment before we graduate inherited. And the only way to do that is to break things apart. It has actually happened in the past that we've had GEPs that ended up getting broken apart. So the in-cluster gateway one that introduced infrastructure sort of got split up into a bunch of GEPs that it was one big GEP that handled a bunch of stuff. Yeah, and so I think it's happened before in the past, but we never realized that it was as much of a thing as it is. And so that's why I want to really make sure we've got tools to handle it. With that, I'm
Cool. This is awesome. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for running that. And I think that also brings us to the end of our agenda, unless anyone has any last things to cover. Cool. All right. Well, have a great holiday season. Hope some of you are able to get some time off, and we'll see you in the new year. I'll still be around on GitHub, of course, and online, but yeah, see you at the next meeting, hopefully. Have
See
a
you all
great one.
later.
See you.